This is producer Carmen Baskoff. Today is Juneteenth. It's a holiday that marks the day slavery finally ended in Texas 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. We don't often think of Connecticut as a slave state, and we often celebrate the role of Connecticut's abolitionists. But American slavery was not just confined to the South. There are an estimated 5,000 slaves who lived and worked right here in Connecticut. And what's more, Connecticut's economy was deeply intertwined with the institution of slavery in the American South and in the West Indies. It's an economic legacy that is still with us as a state today. As we commemorate the Juneteenth holiday and reflect on the legacy of slavery in this country, we wanted to share with you a conversation Lucy had a few years ago with Jennifer Frank. She's the co-author of Complicity, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery.
Jennifer, I wanted to learn a little bit about the backstory, so to speak, on how you ended up working on this book, Complicity. You had a long career at the Hartford Courant, and there was some reporting that was done. Tell us about that.
Right, Lucy. A couple of years before that, there was a story that came across the wires that said Aetna was apologizing for having insured slaves before the Civil War. And this was surprising. It was unbelievable, and I put it on page one, and it caused quite a ruckus. We got calls from across the world, and it was a big deal. After that, some reporters from the Courant, which is famously the longest continuously published newspaper, blah, 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 in America. So they started looking into, did the Courant possibly profit from slavery? And, oh, yes, the Courant ran runaway slave ads for a long time. We were able to find copies of these ads. That went on page one. It ended up with someone from the Courant apologizing for doing that, but really the ball started rolling then, and there was a lot going on in the news, and the word reparations kept coming up. So at this point, I was at Northeast Magazine, the Courant's former Sunday magazine, and we started looking into Connecticut's role and found out that it had a big role in slavery, that along with really other states throughout the North, this was not a Southern institution only. This was the whole country was involved.
Jennifer, how did you go about finding out the extent of Connecticut's role in slavery and how the Northeast benefited from it? What did you do?
Well, we spoke with historians. We spoke with a number of people. There was a historian at Yale at the Gilder Lehrman Center and named Rob Forbes. And just one thing followed another, Lucy, and it turned out that the reality in our state, we thought we knew Connecticut, and we didn't. We didn't understand at all. And we looked at census reports, and at its height, there were 5,100 slaves in this state. There were slaves throughout the Northeast, throughout New England and the Northeast. And it wasn't generally the plantation-style slavery that you had in the South, really in large part because of geography. We don't have the land, but a lot of the most prominent citizens owned slaves, and that's what happened.
We talked about the number of slaves that are estimated to have lived and worked in Connecticut, but can you talk a little bit about how our economy at that time was built on the backs of the slave labor in the South, as well as the free labor they got up north from Connecticut to Rhode Island to Manhattan?
Absolutely. It in our book, we focus to some extent on cotton. And cotton was, of course, grown in the South, and cotton fueled the entire economy of the country at that point. And much, if not most of the cotton came through New York City, was sent to the Industrial Revolution was going on. There were textile mills, of course, in England were the huge ones, but also in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, in Rhode Island. They dotted all the streams and rivers of the Northeast, and there were Boston financiers who virtually created the cities of Lowell and Lawrence, and you can still, on the Mass Pike, you can still see the huge former factories where they turned the cotton into textiles. There was a relationship between North and South. We were one country. We were working together. And cotton is just one example, a huge example of that.
Jennifer Frank is co-author and editor of Complicity, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery. We talked about the connection to cotton from the influence from what was coming up from the South and how northern cities benefited and helped pass through. But what are some of the other industries that benefited from slavery in the Northeast?
Well, Connecticut's nickname was the provisioning state. Sugar was so incredibly profitable that every inch of land on these islands down in the West Indies was devoted to growing sugarcane, but they needed supplies. They needed they had to feed these people. They needed barrels to ship it. There was the famous or infamous triangle trade. And Connecticut was incredibly involved in all of this. It made barrels. Wethersfield today its symbol is the red onion, and they would send those down to the West Indies, and we would send horses, and people made a good living up here, and by helping feed the millions of slaves there over so many years. And very famously, as my co-author Ann Farrow wrote about, we've got Ivoryton, Connecticut. And gee, why is that called Ivoryton? Well, ivory was a huge commodity back then. Pianos were just piano and billiard balls. Were made of ivory. And where does ivory come from? It comes from elephants. And who brought the elephants to the shore? They were hundreds of thousands of slaves who were involved in this, who died in this treacherous enterprise. And Ivoryton made a fortune making keys and billiard balls. So Connecticut was involved on a lot of different spheres, but as Harriet Beecher Stowe said, it was largely at a distance. So we had all the profits, but none of the screams. I'm not sure I have that correct, but we did very well, as did New York, which just New York was so involved in the cotton trade that when the southern states started to secede from the Union, the mayor of New York suggested publicly that New York secede as well because it was so dependent on the trade.
When we talk about slavery and American slavery, we think about the North and the abolition movement. But again, when you hear about these stories and what has come to light over recent decades, it's something that was also the North had an issue with trying to encounter the fact that they were part of this as well. And you mentioned that when the Aetna, Jennifer, when the story ran about Aetna insuring slaves, that caused a ruckus. That was the word you used. But what was the reaction when your book came out?
Well, it was generally extremely positive, and a lot of people were interested. It's interesting, though, that when we would go and talk to people and talk to schools, a lot of pushback and a lot of people saying, well, when this was going on, my relatives were in Ireland or England or wherever, so they had nothing to do with it. But in fact, those ancestors came to a country that was built up on the backs of free labor, and if they're white, they profited indirectly from it. And it's not a blame game. It's You've got to understand who we are and where we're from. And that's what we were trying to do in the book, and it's vital. We just can't move on and be a healthy society without this.
That was Jennifer Frank, co-author of Complicity, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery, speaking to Where We Live back in 2018. I'm Carmen Baskoff. Thanks for listening.